Welcome to Wisdom for Nonprofits, bringing the best business wisdom to the nonprofit world. Proven leaders share their experience, insights, and best practices. Finally, a podcast for the busy nonprofit professional. And now, your trusted advisor, Betina Pflug.
Welcome to the Wisdom for Nonprofit podcast, where we explore insights and strategies to elevate your nonprofit organization. I'm your host, Betina Pflug, and I'm thrilled to have you here joining us today. In this episode, we are diving into the art and science of effective writing and presentations, and how the skills can propel your nonprofit to greater heights. I'm excited to introduce a guest, and I can say like a buddy, because Nicki and I have been working together with Consultants for Good in the United States and in Australia. She is the founder of Leverage IQ, and Nicki is a strategy and execution consultant dedicated to helping organizations bridge the gap between vision and reality. With a strong background in senior management role with various government departments in Australia, as well political advisors roles in the United States, Nicki brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to the table. She graduated magna cum laude with Master International Relations from the University of Denver and is committed to amplify the impact of change-making organizations. Welcome, Nicki. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, Betina, thank you so much for having me today. It's my pleasure.
So as I was mentioned, Nicki and I, we have something in common. Nicki spent some time in the United States, sometimes here in Australia, and we're both a passion about nonprofit. And she has this amazing company called Leverage IQ. Nicki, can you tell me what inspired you to start Leverage IQ and what is the mission in supporting nonprofits?
Yes, thank you, Betina. I'd love to tell you a little bit more about my business, Leveraged IQ. As you mentioned, I come from a background of working in the public service, and I really loved being able to work within organizations that were basically about doing good in the communities around us. And for many years, I was really lucky to have a number of jobs, both in Australia and in the US. Doing a variety of things aimed at making a positive impact in the community around me. And as I progressed through my career and had this vision of wanting to be able to live and work both in Australia and the US, I came to the realization, this was long before the pandemic, that creating that sort of environment was probably up to me. So I had an opportunity about 7 years ago to transition into working as an independent consultant and founding my independent consultancy. And over the years, Betina, I've really come to realize that I just absolutely love this style of working with different clients in change-making industries, whether that's not-for-profit or government or the for-profit sectors. I love the opportunity to work with all sorts of interesting, passionate people who are also still trying to make a difference in the communities around them, but be able to bring my skills and expertise to really help them amplify their capacity to do the good work that they do.
Oh, that's wonderful. And how you define the polished writing, the topic of our podcast here in the context of the nonprofit communication, how important it is for the nonprofit professionals to have this polished writing?
Yes, I mean, I would say good polished business writing and good polished business presentations are important in every sector and industry. But I mean, we're specifically focused on nonprofits today, and I'm sure you find this in the work that you do, Betina, with nonprofits as well. Everyone is so stretched and pressed for time and running at 1,000,000 miles an hour. And so I think it's often easy for people to get lost within that in terms of really good business writing falls by the wayside. And, that's so difficult because clear communication is one of the most important things that makes us effective in the work that we do. But I don't think we always necessarily stop and think about that in our day-to-day work.
Yeah, that's so important. And get ready for that. Even if we have ChatGPT to help us out nowadays, it's important for you to have the skills, né? How can
Yes.
you share why effective writing is particularly crucial for um, nonprofits, not just writing, but presentations? That's the topic also.
Yes. So I think for nonprofits, part of what makes good polished writing, presenting, effective communication so important is because, well, it's hard to paint all nonprofits with the same brush. We can certainly say that, the nonprofits that I work with, and I'm sure you work with, are really, embedded in their communities, trying to do that good work every day. And that requires building lots of coalitions of supporters, whether that's, sort of generating goodwill within the community, engaging your supporters, really, making sure that your funders are coming back. And, all of that requires really excellent, regular, consistent communication. And I think that's just so important for nonprofits.
And what are the common writing challenge nonprofits, professionals face, or even nonprofit organizations?
Yeah, I would say the biggest challenge that nonprofits and others face, I think this is probably pretty universal, is lack of time. So one of my favorite expressions that I think sums up this challenge particularly well is, I would have written a shorter letter, but I did not have the time. And, looking at that, you would think, oh, that's a really contemporary statement, but it actually comes from a French mathematician and scientist from the 1600s. But I just think that illustrates so well the common challenge that we often have as humans, really, is because we lack time and we're trying to churn out a piece as quickly as possible, we often then put the burden on our reader or recipient of information to digest and understand what we're trying to convey, because we haven't done the hard work ourselves in making that information as crystal clear and succinct and polished as we can. So I would say that's probably, the biggest challenge that most people face, whether you're in the nonprofit sector or other sectors as well.
You're right, because all the nonprofit professionals, they wear so many hats. It's hard
Mm,
to find extra time to polish your writing, but that's something very
absolutely.
important. And also something important is to identify their intended audience when writing and crafting their materials. How can the nonprofits identify their intended audience when preparing their material?
I'm glad you raised that, Bettina, because yes, I do think that really knowing who your audience is and understanding your audience and their preferences is so important before you ever put pen to paper, so to speak, or I guess, these days, hands to keyboards. But that's where I talk about good business writing, good business presenting being both an art and a science. The science part is that there's lots of templates and frameworks you can follow to try to make your writing and presenting clearer, easier to understand. But for me, before you ever start writing a piece of work, the real task begins in the thinking. So often I think the tendency, and I'm certainly guilty of this myself, but I see this in others, is to just start writing. Just sit down and start writing without really kind of thinking through what is the purpose, what sort of product am I creating? Is that the right product for this situation? And particularly, who is my audience? What does the person I'm trying to convey this information to, what does their day look like? I'm busy, but they're probably even busier. So they're probably facing time pressures themselves. They probably have preferences in how they receive information. Am I writing in a way that meets my purposes, or does it meet theirs? Really trying to cater for your audience's preferences and understand those, I think goes a long way to helping your material be received and have the impact that you want it to have.
So you're just saying that it's very important to know the purpose of your writing before just to start doing it, isn't it right?
That's it, exactly. Know your purpose and know your audience. What does your audience want?
Mhm. And what frameworks do you recommend for nonprofits to improve their writing and presentations?
Yes, I am. So I routinely train folks in writing and presentation, and there's lots of frameworks out there for people to use. And I think the point of it is find what works for you. Um, but there's a couple that I like to teach in my trainings, and actually have used myself for a number of years. So one of the particular frameworks that I really like to use comes from a book by a famous McKinsey consultant, Barbara Minto. She's developed the pyramid principle. And essentially, the pyramid principle is if you imagine, picture in your mind a pyramid and the point at the top of the pyramid, the essence of this idea is that you convey the most important information at the top. So at the top of the pyramid, and you build out your argument, your case, whatever it is exactly that you're trying to convey. You build out those layers of information. So that's the essence of the pyramid principle. What I particularly like about that framework is the top of the pyramid. And I understand, Bettina, they still teach this to McKinsey consultants and new recruits today, but that top of the pyramid is a framework called the situation, complication, question framework. And essentially what that does is it provides a model to be able to frame your ideas in a way that's easily conveyed to your audience, whether that's in a written format or a verbal format, starting with the situation. So essentially, why are we here? Why am I raising this piece of information with you? What do I need you to know about where we are right now? The
Mhm.
complication is what's changed. Why do I need to talk to you about this now? Has something gone awry, or do we need to move in a direction? And there's typically a key question around that. So, based on the situation and the complication, what is that sort of key question that I need to convey to my audience? And then the final piece of this framework is the hypothesis or next steps. So essentially, coming out of that question, I might have an idea of what I think the path ahead is. So that's my hypothesis. Or I might be very definitive on steps A, B, and C need to happen now. So that's the next step. And I've used this model countless times. I couldn't even begin to quantify it in my own writing. Whether it's something as simple as an email, whether it's something longer like a report, even in things like verbal presentations, you can use that framework to come up with a really quick 30-second pitch,
That
particularly in times of, high stress. I find it really helpful to have that fallback on.
That's really good. And it really works when you already have a relationship established with someone. Can you try to give an example? How can we use this framework in a potential donor that you have for your organization that hasn't done any donation yet?
Mm. That's a great question. If you don't have necessarily a pre-existing relationship with the donor, but perhaps you're trying to cultivate that relationship, I still think this framework, this model works in that sense, because essentially when you're approaching a new donor, there will be some reason why you have gone to that particular organization or person. And the driver of that is the situation that you find yourself in. So I think
Mhm.
you start off in that same sort of framing, what is the current situation? Sort of essentially, why should they engage? Why should they care? Why should they talk to you?
Mhm.
Um, the complication, there will be something driving your fundraising efforts. So whether it's a particular fundraising target you're trying to reach at a particular period of time, or perhaps a campaign for a certain aspect that you're fundraising. That is essentially the complication. And I suppose then the key question really becomes about, will this donor give? And what are the next steps to make that happen? So I think it's still, you can play around with that and make this framing work for really any particular context.
Yeah, that's great. That's a very useful framework. And can you share some success stories where improved writing on presentation significantly help a nonprofit, someone that you already coach or gave a training?
Mhm.
How that impacted their nonprofits?
Yeah, so I've delivered this training within teams, and typically what happens is the leader of that team will come to me and say, "Oh gosh, you know what, Nikki, I am just overwhelmed by information from my colleagues, my teams, the people I'm working with. I mean, I cannot read another long email. I cannot read another long report. I am just saturated, and I wish there was a way that I could get my people around me just a little bit more focused, a little bit more clear, and it didn't require so much back and forth for me to help shape up a final piece of work. And so often that's the situation folks find themselves in when they come to me looking for support in this training. And then I'll go through usually 2 training sessions with their team, and we'll tailor it really specifically to their organization and their context. Because as we talked about at the beginning, Bettina, it's so important to know who's your audience, what are their preferences, how do they take in information, what are the sort of norms within your organization about how information is shared and conveyed. All of that is really important to understand up front before we ever dive into any of the frameworks. And I've given you one example today, but there's others. And so we will go through a couple of sessions with teams. And, I think it's really important to do that in a team context so that people are hearing the same information at the same time and also have an opportunity to raise questions, to discuss among their colleagues, have that opportunity to interact with one another. And then what I hear from the people that I work with after going through these trainings, they come back to me and they say, "Oh my gosh, Nikki, you wouldn't believe how quickly we've turned around in terms of I'm getting much sharper presentations, much clearer writing from my teams. Just going through this exercise of getting people to pause and reflect on a number of the elements that we've talked about today before they ever begin to write has made such a difference. And then those final products that I'm receiving are so much clearer and easier to understand." So I've seen some pretty great, I suppose, transformations within teams when they work through this training.
I think that the main success might be then they will be saving time because not redoing work, having a more sharp communication with their stakeholders. That's really huge.
That's spot on, Bettina. Absolutely. And it goes back to one of the things that we talked about at the very beginning. One of the main challenges for people around this is the lack of time. But in fact, investing just that little bit more time up front before you ever embark on creating something can save so much time down the road.
And how do you think visual elements enhance presentations and writing materials?
Yeah. Oh, such a great question. I am a huge proponent of good visual presentation as well. I always think that the first things people engage with are what your product looks like. And so that could be anything. I mean, we could be talking about slides in a PowerPoint. We could be talking about a report, even an email. The very first thing people see is what does it look like, and that sort of naturally shapes how we're going to interact with that material as we then begin to read it. So I'm a big fan of white space on pages, breaking things up with headings and bullet points, good visuals, well-designed visuals, just making that content really visually engaging from the very beginning.
Oh, that's really good. And do you have some best practice that you could recommend for creating compelling presentations that really resonates when we're talking about the diverse audience that the nonprofits deal with?
hmm Gosh, I mean, I probably have lots of tips that I could spend a whole bunch of time talking through, but I won't consume our time in that way. But I suppose some of the kind of top tips that I share with folks in thinking about preparing material is firstly thinking about whether this is something that you are preparing because you want people to read it, or are you preparing it because it's a presentation? That will change the nature of the material that you're preparing. And even think about a slide pack. How many times have you looked at a slide pack? You're sitting in a room, somebody is verbally presenting, and you see the slides on the screen, and they are just so chock full of information. You can't really take in what the person presenting is saying because you're sort of distracted by what's on the screen, but you're not really getting any of the information. And so, in that instance, uh, I would say somebody's made a bit of a mistake in that those slides should have been much clearer, shorter, sharper, because they were not intended to be given to someone to take away and read. They were intended to complement a verbal presentation. So even things like that, what is the intended purpose of the product? To my mind, that's one of the most important things to start off with.
I totally agree with you. When I do my trainings for nonprofits, there is one that I really like. It's called How to Manage Tasks Like a Pro. What I normally do, I have a PowerPoint presentation that supports my speech, and it's very concise, only with bullet points. But every time I finish a presentation, I do have a PDF that's a summary of what I have been talking and explaining with an exercise, because I want people to practice what they have learned. So every training that I go, I give a summary of what we have discussed, like a guideline for them to revisit the concept, and an exercise. Because one of the things that I have is so important. The only way you know you learned something is when you're able to teach someone else about it.
Yes.
So if you attend to any of Nicki's training, please afterwards put in practice, try to teach someone else. That's when you know you have learned.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, and I love it, Betina. You have got it down. I think that is brilliant, having those two different styles of this is a presentation to complement, what I am telling people verbally, followed by here's a pack so that you can help retain the information, learn that information, then teach others because you've retained it so well. That's fantastic.
Yeah, you mentioned something about verbal. Let's talk about verbal pitch. In your opinion, what are the key elements of a strong verbal pitch? And that's so important for nonprofits because they're out there explaining about their mission and everything, how they can have a strong verbal pitch.
Yes. I mean, having a strong verbal pitch, lots of people, we talk about having your 30-second elevator pitch. And, what do we mean by that? What is a 30-second elevator pitch? So I think fundamentally for me, it comes down to being able to tell a story in an engaging and concise way that leaves room for people to ask questions. So you don't necessarily want to try to convey every element in your head all at once. It really is about hooking someone in with that initial idea and then creating that space for a dialogue, for an ongoing conversation. So there's a framework that I do like, that I think really assists with verbal presentations, by a Stanford lecturer, Matt Abrahams, and it's called basically a compelling pitch. So it starts off with, what if you could? And you talk about essentially, a future state. What is, an idea that's sort of really engaging your audience in something that you're really passionate about and want to do. So paint a picture of the future. And this one, I'm sure folks can do a Google and find the framework. But I think the essential points here are, creating that sort of idea of what's possible in the future, connecting it as a relevant goal for your listener, following that up with some concrete examples, and then demonstrating that potential future impact is a way to sort of create a story and hook in your audience in that way, in a quick way.
Yeah, when you were talking, I was imagining myself in a networking event and doing that. It's so important. It's easier to tell a story than just to give like a verbal pitch. I love your idea.
Absolutely.
And at the
Absolutely.
end, really connecting to what's important to the person who is listening to you. That's
Yes.
great. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So now let's cover our last topic that's super important is how can nonprofit professionals develop a consistent voice across all the different communication platforms? Because we talk here about emails, presentation, verbal pitch, and how they can have this
Mhm.
consistent voice.
That's a great question, Bettina, and a challenging one, absolutely, especially when you're talking about an organization comprised of many people. So you're not necessarily all writing in the same voice because you have different voices, but trying to understand what is the voice of your organization. I'm a big fan of creating things like style guides. So having conversations among your people, among your teams about how do we write, how do we speak, how do we present, how do we convey information that represents our organization, answering those questions, and then documenting that really concretely and clearly in a style guide that anyone across the organization can access to have really clear guidance on, if you are creating, whether it's a social media post or an email newsletter or even materials internally. How do you talk? What's the voice that you want to convey? Um, I think being as clear and consistent internally as you can really then helps people convey that externally.
That's wonderful. And if people want to know, it's possible to include this style guide inside ChatGDP. If you want to learn more on how to use ChatGDP for your nonprofit, you can schedule a time to talk. But there is a possibility for you to include a style guide, and you can have different style guides in different environments and folders on ChatGDP. So you can have ChatGDP talking as your fundraising manager, as your board, and it's amazing what ChatGPT can do, but it's
It
important
really
to learn more how to use it properly.
I absolutely agree with that because I think that AI tools like ChatGPT can be great thought starters or thought partners, but I'm sure we have all experienced now. You can pretty clearly tell when something has been written by AI, it lacks that human tone, that human warmth. So
Yeah.
I also like those tools for it's helpful when you're not just necessarily starting with a blank page, but then really bringing your personality, your voice to that. I think is so important as well.
Yeah, I think the combination of both is so important. And
Mhm.
having your training as a guideline, like a start in a nonprofit, will be very, very valuable for different nonprofits because professionals, they need to know how to communicate, not rely on tools. I think the
Absolutely.
tools are very benefit. For example, a lot of nonprofit leaders, they are from different countries. And I'm an expat coach. I know from firsthand how hard it is for you to be a foreigner, and English is not your first language. So
Mm.
having a tool like Grammarly to help you fix the English, because sometimes you know the words, you know the vocabulary, but you write as you were writing in another language. So it's
Yes.
very important to use Grammarly or ChatGPT to revisit the construction of your phrases afterwards for people that has English as a second language. That's my advice.
Oh,
It's a big challenge.
yeah, it's so true. And another tool that I would add into that is I love Hemingway Editor. So this is another tool that you can just find online, and you can essentially copy and paste any material into this, and it will tell you what level of reading comprehension is it at. So, if you're trying to create material that's accessible to a broad audience, and then you find yourself writing for someone who's got, advanced graduate level of education, Hemingway Editor will tell you where you're landing on that. So that's another tool I like to use pretty regularly as well.
That's a good tip, Nikki. Maybe you can
Yeah,
send me the link for those tools and we can put the three of them on the description of the podcast so people can look into later on.
absolutely.
Yeah. So my final question to you: what advice would you give for nonprofit leaders who may be feeling not confident in their writing skills and their presentation skills? What would you recommend for them?
For any nonprofit professionals out there who are not feeling super confident in their writing or their presenting skills, I would firstly say to them, you are not alone. So many people feel this way. Even for people who've had advanced education, we're not often taught, say, in a university context, how to write for a business context. So it's very different. And it, in my experience, it's just something that takes practice. I think a really easy way to start is by finding some frameworks that you feel comfortable using. And we've talked about a couple of those today. So just start experimenting with those and see how that works for you. I would also encourage people to talk to their colleagues, share work, get another fresh set of eyes on a piece of work as a kind of a thought partner, as an editor. It's always really helpful when we have a tendency to get stuck in our own head. So having a trusted colleague look at our material can be quite helpful too.
Thank you. Thank you for everything. Thank you for joining for this enlightening discussion with Nicki Van Veen on how to polish writing presentations and how this can help your nonprofit success. Remember, effective communication is the key to bridging the gap between your organization's vision and its execution. If you want to connect with Nicki or learn more about her work at Leverage IQ, please check out the description of this podcast. And she really would like you to enroll for her weekly, it's monthly or weekly newsletter, Nicki?
Monthly, every 4 to 6 weeks.
Well, every 4 to 6 weeks, Nicki sends a video helping your nonprofit with several tools. So I really encourage you to do that. And if you want, please subscribe to our Wisdom for Nonprofit podcast for more insights and strategies to empower your organization. Until next time, keep thriving for the excellence of your mission. Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Wisdom for Nonprofits. To hear past and future episodes, please subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast channel. We appreciate your reviews and suggestions for future show topics. If you have a question or a suggestion, please write to us at podcast@wity.tech. More resources are available for you at our website, wity.tech. And please join us in the Wisdom for Nonprofits group on LinkedIn. Wisdom for Nonprofits is copyright 2019 by Betina Pflug and wity.tech. All rights reserved.